Welcome to Wild Turkey Science, a podcast made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow. I'm Dr. Marcus Lashley, Professor of Wildlife Ecology at the University of Florida.
And I'm Dr. Will Goolsby, Professor of Wildlife Ecology and Management at Auburn University. We're both lifelong hunters and devoted scientists who are passionate about hunting, managing, and researching wild turkeys.
In this podcast, we'll explore turkey research, speak to the experts in the field, and address the difficult questions related to wild turkey ecology and management.
Our goal
is to serve as your connection to wild turkey science.
This is going to be a fun conversation. So we're here today with Dr. Dwayne Elmore, who is the Director of Upland Game Bird Research at Tall Timbers. Did I get that right, Dwayne?
Yeah, it's close enough.
Close enough. I knew I was going to mess it up in some way, shape, or form, but we're actually in person here at Tall Timbers. Came down for the Georgia-Florida Turkey Invitational. Excited about the dinner that's going to be associated with that tonight to kind of kick things off. But Dwayne has done a tremendous amount of work with a wide variety of upland game bird species. And Dwayne, we're glad to have you here. And really what we wanted to focus this conversation on today is there's a lot of discussion going on about the reproductive ecology and the reproductive behaviors of wild turkeys and whether we should or shouldn't factor that into our spring hunting season frameworks. And so kind of what we wanted to do today is disentangle that by talking about the wide array and diversity of reproductive strategies that are used by various upland species, and then, use that to parlay into talking about how turkeys fit along that spectrum and how that might inform, management of the species.
Yeah, absolutely. And, as part of that discussion has come up, one of the things that's been suggested is that turkey might be accurately classified as a lecking game bird.
That's where my vision for where we should start this. I'm not sure. I'm not sure that even I would be able to fully describe what lecking means. And I get asked enough about what lecking is, or an exploded lek. I hear turkeys referred to as an exploded lek. So I think that'd be a great place to kind of start, just in general, what is lecking, and maybe talk about some different species that are doing different versions of that, or different different spectrum of that kind of behavior.
Yeah. So the word lek derived from a Swedish word lecka, and my Swedish friends are probably grimacing right now. I'm sure I mispronounced that. But that word basically means like child's play, to play. So it can be a noun or verb. So when we're thinking about that in terms of an animal, you can use it like a noun, like the lek, the place that the animals are breeding, or to lek or lecking, like a verb, like the activity of. And so that, Scandinavian word origin, it was really initially used to describe grouse, like black grouse, capercaillie, European grouse. Because of these communal aggregations that were observed, where lots of males were displaying in close proximity, and I mean very close proximity, like maybe only defending a couple of feet area, and females attracted to that, mating with some dominant males on these sites. So we typically think of leks when we're describing birds, but it's not just birds. Lots of different taxa lek. Insects, fish, mammals, which we need to talk about that later, because that's really important to the turkey discussion. But generally, the driving force of lecking is that it's strong female mate choice, and that really matters. There's a spectrum of how animals might form leks, but basically it's all factored around strong female mate choice. She's making the decision of who to mate with.
So in the case of some species, and you can name us some species if you want to talk about it, but in a species that that most people would agree is a strong lecking species, all of the males, like you talked about in defending feet, it sounds like to me, it's a place where the females can essentially come and size up all the males at the same time.
Yeah, if you look into like the evolutionary ecology literature about why some species lack and others don't, because it's really fascinating because you would think, well, if there's certain environmental characteristics that are forcing this evolution of a species to go in that direction, that all the species in that general area would behave that way, and they don't. Like, think about greater sage grouse. And that's at the end of the spectrum of strong classic leks. But there's lots of species that co-occur with greater sage grouse, including birds that do not lek. So there's definitely, some confusion and differences of opinion about why this is happening for some species and not others. And likely all these different species that do lek, there's different probably mechanisms that are driving it. Some of the ones that have been proposed would be like the hot shot hypothesis, basically, which is saying that males are making the decision, not on who to mate with, but where to lek. So males, for whatever reason, choose an area to aggregate, and the females come to them because that's where the males are. And there's some evidence for that for some species. Another one is the hotspot hypothesis, meaning that the males are really choosing where to aggregate based on where the density of females is highest.
Mm-hmm.
And there's pretty strong evidence for that amongst some of the grouse, like grouse that I've worked mostly on, greater prairie chickens, pretty good evidence that the hot spot hypothesis is likely. And we've demonstrated that to some extent with a study where we burned in a mosaic pattern on a large landscape, and all of a sudden these quote stable leks that we think of not moving over time, they start moving all over the place. Which
were they going into the burned area?
The males would move if the lek was like in the center of a huge burned area, and this might be like 1,000-acre burn.
Yeah.
If the lek had historically been in what was the center of the burn, they would shift to the edge. Now, why would they do that? Well, it's suggesting that two things could be going on. One, they wanted to be closer to cover, escape cover, if they needed to escape predators. But probably more likely is they wanted to be near the nesting cover where the hens were spending all their time, because the hens aren't going to nest in the barn. So that suggests that hot spot, that the females are really driving that to some extent. That was a likely scenario in that case. But there's also, black hole hypothesis, which basically just says the females are highly mobile. They're trying to avoid males most of the time. They don't want to be around males, but when they do come across a lek, they'll breed kind of opportunistically. So there's also kin selection that suggests that males on a given lek are closely related to each other. That's been shown in some species, but certainly not in all. And then there's the predation protection hypothesis, which suggests that there's benefits to the males by being in that aggregation. If you're doing all this displaying, you're not only attracting females, you're attracting something that's going to kill you.
Yeah.
So if you're in a group, it's better to be in that group because your individual odds of getting killed might be lower than if you were displaying alone.
Right.
And it could be that multiple things are driving this all at once for a species, not just one.
And in virtually all these species, and certainly it's the case in turkeys, the males are most vulnerable during this breeding time, right?
And that's really important to think about when we're bringing this back to turkeys. If you're going to all this effort to be loud, to be visible, to be brightly colored, to puff up, all these elaborate displays that a lot of these lecking species go through, your survival is probably going to take a hit. Something is going to be attracted to you. So
specifically during the breeding
activity. And that matters from an evolutionary standpoint because, even before humans were involved, lots of predators would be queuing in on that. So it behooves you to be able to compensate for that in some way, knowing, because the individual male survival can be, and of course, a lot of these species that we're talking about are highly polygamous. That's another characteristic to think about with these lecking animals, because their strong female mate choice she's not randomly mating with whatever male she comes across. She's picking, and presumably multiple females are attracted to the same characteristics and thus picking a few males out of the population to do their breeding with. So there's only a few males that might be really contributing most of the genetic material to that group of females.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's almost like in a lecking species, they would have to be adapted almost to the expectation that male survival is going to be lower during the breeding season.
Yeah, and you see that with a lot of these lecking birds. Greater prairie chicken, for example, a lot of males get killed on the lek during the spring. The rest of the year, their survival is actually pretty high, but during the spring, they get hammered. And you see predators queuing in, because with prairie chickens, they're fairly predictable locations. They might move from year to year, but within a year, they're pretty much every morning you can go out. That's how we trap them. We set up traps the night before because we know within feet where they're going to be the next morning. You can see their droppings all over the ground. Well, we know that. Coyotes know that. Raptors know that. And we've seen situations where, you'll have a dozen raptors lined up in the morning around a lek, watching that lek, waiting for them to fly in. And these males are getting killed. I mean, they're just getting hammered.
So we know that, animal predators might be a problem during that time of the year for species that exhibit these characteristics. But what about human hunting? Are there any examples of other species that are lecking species or somewhere on that spectrum that are hunted?
Well, and let me preface that I've heard this said multiple times with turkeys that they're the only ones that we hunt during the lecking breeding behavior.
Yeah, that's totally false. Yeah, there's many species that are hunted during the lecking period. If we just stick to grouse for a minute, dusky grouse and sooty grouse or in Alaska would be hunted, or what historically was called blue grouse. They've now been split into two species, but they're hunted throughout the lecking period. And in fact, according to Alaska Game and Fish, the most popular time for people to hunt them is in April, because that's when the males are visible. It's easy to find them and shoot them out of a tree.
While they're lecking.
Now, granted, it's not a trivial point that harvest is low, because population density of human hunters is low. In vast areas, and lots of areas never even see a human hunter. So that does matter. But capercaillie are hunted in Russia. They're shot off the lek. Black grouse shot off the lek in parts of Europe. But then when we back up a little bit and think of species that maybe aren't classical lek, meaning they're concentrated, but maybe more of an exploded lek, which we need to describe what that is. But that's where it really gets to be a big list. There's lechwe in Africa. There's red deer, and North American elk would be potentially described as exploded lek. And they are absolutely hunted during the rut when they are displaying, trying to attract females. So we hunt a lot of species that are quote lecking.
So not only do we hunt a lot of species that are not game birds, you also listed several that are game birds. And you can correct me where I'm wrong, but particularly the capercaillie, they seem to have fairly high hunting pressure compared to like the grouse and Alaska you were talking about.
It's variable. I mean, the capercaillie are in some parts of Europe are just at desperately low population numbers. In some populations, they've curtailed hunting altogether. Norway, they're a very popular game bird and pretty high limit, but still, not just tons and tons of hunters, but decent harvest of capercaillie in Norway, so in some countries. But the predominant thought of capercaillie is their decline is related to habitat loss. They're very sensitive to human activity. They collide with ski cables, and they don't seem to tolerate human activity very well. So there's a lot of complicated factors going on that's driving their population losses. Hunting not being at the top of the list.
And so, we were talking about it just a minute ago. We were discussing how it would make sense for a species that, where males are conspicuous during the breeding season, thus driving increased rates of mortality, that, they would have to be, ecologically, they would need to be able to compensate for those losses, right?
Mhm.
But in addition to that, another thing that kind of came to mind while you were talking or making those last couple of points is it seems like if that's the expectation that male mortality is going to be greater during the breeding season, that there would also need to be mechanisms in place where females resume breeding with other males after that, after the males that they may have already selected have been removed either by a human predator or, a human hunter or an animal predator.
Mhm. Yeah, and so there's several ways that an animal could deal with that. One, uh, breed again, or even if you're just thinking about losing your first nest, to come back to the lek and rebreed. And we
Right.
certainly see that with the classic lekking species, that the males will display long enough that if a female loses her first nest, you come back and breed again. Also, sperm storage,
Yeah.
which I know y'all covered that ad nauseum in another podcast, but turkeys clearly do that. A lot of species can store sperm.
So it could be an insurance policy.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I just read this morning in one of Lovett Williams' books. He noted even back when that was written, and a while back, several decades ago, he was noting how long turkeys could store sperm,
Mhm.
which was pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What did do you remember in the podcast where we covered the sperm storage? There are some examples, at least from domestic turkeys, where there were eggs fertilized presumably 5 months
Yeah.
Mhm.
after breeding, and then
Right.
there's multiple references to there being capability of them storing it at least 2 months.
Yeah. One thing that we don't know for sure, I think, is that we know they're capable of storing sperm for prolonged periods of time, but it does seem to be pretty clear that the viability of the sperm starts dropping off,
Mhm.
within a relatively short period of time
Yeah.
after the insemination event. But what we don't know is when, like when does it reach some kind of threshold where the potential viability of embryos that are, that she's trying to fertilize and lay that egg
Yeah, we really need to
starts
do that
to
work.
diminish.
We really need to do that work.
Yeah.
But some of the stuff that Lovett was saying, and also that Texas report suggests that viability up to 2 months is pretty reasonable,
Right.
based on what they were saying.
Right. Right.
So while the sperm might be less viable, they're still good enough.
Yeah.
I guess is what I'm saying.
And then also circling back to that, alternative mate selection when maybe the preferred mate disappears for whatever reason. And some of that work that was done in South Texas on Weber Wildlife Refuge, Stokes and Watts was the paper. They showed that when one male was occupied with another hen, that a subordinate male was presented a breeding opportunity with another hen that had
Actively bred at the same time.
that was receptive. And then there was another example in that study where after the death of a male that was a preferred breeder by the hens, and they didn't say what the cause of death was, but he died nonetheless, that a previously subordinate male took the place of that male relatively rapidly.
Yeah.
It sounded like it was the same day.
Yeah.
And I think most turkey hunters have probably observed that, right? Like you're hunting a group of 3 birds, one of them appears to be dominant, the other's kind of hanging back. You shoot that dominant bird, you come out there a couple days later, and things have changed. I mean, those birds are behaving very differently, and all of a sudden those two have a whole different posture. So, there's definitely resorting. How long that takes, I think, is a good question.
Yeah.
And needs more work to address.
Yeah.
There's probably a lot of things that influence that. Total number of females that are available, total number of males, potential age of male. I mean, there's a lot of factors that could be influencing that, but the hierarchy can get shuffled. And in some cases, at least, it behaviorally, it appears to happen very rapidly. And that's important because when you think about from a female mate choice standpoint, she's picking whatever characteristic she's looking for, whether it's loudness of display in some species that's been demonstrated, visual characteristics of males in some species that's been
And maybe
demonstrated.
those are long range versus shorter range cues.
Exactly. Which we need to circle back to the exploded leg to talk about
Yeah,
that.
no, we keep getting sidetracked.
We gotta cover that in depth. But you know, in a nutshell, she's choosing from the available males before her. And that's an important point. So you could say, well, there could be a better male,
Yeah,
but if it's not available to her, well, this is her world.
Yeah.
So at some level, she's going to choose a mate from what is before her.
right. And from my work, those other males are ready to breed from a physiological standpoint. All of
Yeah,
our
they're
adult
all
gobblers are fertile. Now, there's variability in that fertility, but it's not like the variability that you see between an adult gobbler and a jake,
Mhm.
right? So a jake may have like 50% of the sperm production that a gobbler does. So we're not seeing that stark of a difference between different individual adult males, but it seems like they're primed, they're ready, and it's just that they're waiting for the opportunity. They're behaviorally excluded from breeding up.
Well, even the jakes, I mean, Lovett noted that some of the efforts, the restocking efforts, they only stocked jakes,
Yeah,
and they still presumably did. I mean, they restocked them successfully, so presumably those jakes did the breeding, and they didn't
right.
an adult male to suppress that behavior.
Yeah,
And your work shows that, and some other work shows that, 50 to 2/3 of the jakes by the middle of the breeding season at least, have become fertile.
yeah. The Texas work was pretty clear. Than in the 1 year where they sampled jakes, further into the spring, that by around the first or second week of April, most of those jakes
Yeah, it was 2/3, I think.
were producing sperm.
Yeah, so they were sexually mature,
Mhm.
but behaviorally excluded, which
Right.
is the same thing Lovett was saying in his book, that it was a behavioral suppression. So
Right.
presumably, if you remove the males that are suppressing it, they might be able to just pick it up.
Yeah.
More work needs to be done on that, but they're at least viable.
Not that that's an ideal situation, but there are
Mhm.
compensatory mechanisms if the
Right.
leg gets disrupted.
Here's another wrench I'd like to throw in the spokes really quick. I've been thinking about while y'all were conversing. And we're about to have an episode on this with the guy that did the work with Krakauer. There's also multiple paternity very commonly, and
Mhm.
that suggests to me that she's not just choosing a male. She might be choosing several males.
Yep.
So that's another mechanism built into this, that if one of your choice males dies, you've still got bred by potentially several.
And that's happening even amongst species that traditionally galliforms, game birds that we traditionally might have thought of as more monogamous, like bobwhite.
Mhm.
Did a study in Oklahoma and found that on average, the females, their clutch, if you look at the genetic material from each individual egg in a clutch, that on average she had bred with 2.5 males.
Yeah.
Some of them had bred with 4 males.
I wonder what that half male looked like. I'm just
It
kidding. No, but
was a Jake.
so they're considered traditionally monogamous.
Well, that's what people
because
used to think,
because the male is sharing some of the responsibility for
typically, with bobwhite, the male will breed and then the female goes off and nests. But especially under high density situations in good reproductive years, she will sometimes lay a clutch and then let the male incubate, and then she'll
Yeah.
go nest again. So they're not necessarily both.
they don't always participate.
They don't always, but they have the ability to.
That's
Mhm.
weird.
It is.
Well, I've also heard in turkeys that you kind of have the period where, and this was from Rio work and, much more open country than Easterns live in. But they kind of had this, it was almost like a lecking ground. But then when the hens started going off to nest, you start to see some of the males disperse in different directions following hens.
Sure.
And then that's when they're getting they're getting breeding opportunity. They may have not had it on the lecking grounds, but as those hens move off, there's not a single male that can dominate all that breeding opportunity. But I think Marcus brings up an important point with multiple paternity, and it's that in contrast to what I was saying earlier, like they need to have strategies to choose another male relatively quickly. Well, they may have already chosen several one or more other males. A hen may already be breeding with 2 to 3 males so that she has alternatives available.
And you think about why, from an evolutionary standpoint, why would a bird do that? Well, you're hedging your bets.
Absolutely.
Because what if one of those males is infertile? Well,
what if you
it behooves you to mate with multiple males.
Yeah.
No.
It behooves you to mate with several. But there's also been multiple maternity in the nest, which we have talked about, where essentially a hen is kind of parasitizing a nest.
Dump nesting.
Which is sort of the same guard for a different reason, a different part of this whole system. But if one nest, like if you put all of your investment in one nest and you fail,
you wanted to say all your eggs in one basket, didn't you?
I did.
He was.
You invest all in one nest. It makes a lot more sense if you know a couple of your buddy hens have nests around, and you can slip an egg in 2 or 3 different nests. You increase the chances that some of your offspring do it. And if everybody's doing that, it's sort of a bet hedging strategy where it sounds like the mate selection part for the female could also, or is also that way. And we have clear data showing multiple paternity, various other mechanisms in place to guard against that male being removed, disrupting the whole thing.
So yeah, this is also fascinating. It's easy to get sidetracked down all these different rabbit trails, but we need to talk about where exploded legs and kind of where turkeys fit in this whole spectrum.
Where do they fit on the spectrum?
So
let's start with what is an exploded leg.
Yeah, so we'll start with a classic leg just to make sure that's clear. Classic leg would be a group of males that are very spatially aggregated. They are visually and by sound, auditory, in contact with each other.
So in those cases, is there evidence from any game birds that the auditory is playing an important role? Even because they're all aggregated in a spot, they presumably could always be seen, but the auditory part is also.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And in that situation, it's interesting because you'll, like prairie chickens as an example, you often see females gravitating towards larger aggregations of males. So in a given population, you might have 10 leks spread across 20,000 acres. A lot of these leks are, might be 5 to 8 animals, males, but a couple of them are like 12 to 20. Well, you want to trap, if you're trying to trap hens, you go to the 12 and 20 because there's going to be a lot more females showing up. In fact, some of these leks that have 3 or 4 males, you might trap for a week and never see a female. So there's a lot more female activity on these larger male aggregations.
Is that what's driving, or maybe there's not a particular factor, or maybe it's not well known, but I just am trying to think of mechanisms that would attract more females, and maybe that the bigger male group is just in a better habitat situation where there's more females, but it sounds like to me there may be.
Well, she's got more choices. I mean, and she can size them up simultaneously.
Well, I'm wondering, like from a mechanistic standpoint, are they just that much louder that attracts her to it? Is that what you're saying?
Well, potentially there is more when you have more males, they typically are more actively displaying, because they're cueing in off each other, especially when a female shows up. It's really interesting.
This is positive feedback.
Absolutely. I mean, you can be sitting there in the blind waiting on the female to show up on the leg, and the males are kind of just ho-hum displaying, and all of a sudden the activity goes through the roof, and you don't even have to look up. Female just stepped out. And then you look and it's like, oh, yep, there she is. And they always walk to the center of the leg and sit down and kind of nonchalantly. They act like they're not really paying attention, but they're paying attention. They're pecking like they're feeding, but they're really looking at these males, and they'll walk through. Sometimes they don't breathe. They'll just walk through and keep going, and they'll come back, but they're sizing up. And typically the dominant males are in the center of the lek, in a classic lek, and that's where the females go. They instinctively know to go to the center of the lek where those dominant males are, and the more subdominant ones are on the periphery. And in some cases, they're even satellite leks, meaning you can hear them, but they're not in visual range, but
Yeah.
there's two I can hear them out in the grass 100 yards away. They're trying, but they've been kicked off to the side. And there was a classic study in Kansas, Robel did, where they actually went in. They had a permit in the spring to go kill the dominant males on prairie chicken lek. And they did this. They shot the dominant males, and the males went ballistic. I mean, basically, they had to resort themselves out, and it was kind of chaos to the point that the females avoided the lek for some period of time. And that's really fascinating anecdotal study, because it was really just one lek, not replicated.
Right.
And I've heard folks use that as an argument to say that, well, because that happened, maybe that's happening in turkeys, and maybe that's a problem. And that's a stretch, because you're talking about a strong classic lecking animal in greater prairie chickens.
Like those males may be displaying in a few square feet almost.
Oh yeah. I mean, they're the distance from me to you.
Yeah.
And that's an important characteristic of these classic leks, is the males are defending a very small space that probably isn't even in their normal home range, which is part of the definition of a lek, that the males are aggregating together and it's not their normal home range. They only go to that area to display, to attract females, and the rest of the year they might not be on that lek very much at all. So that's a classic. Now we need to shift to the exploded.
Yeah.
And an exploded lek is the males are much broader distributed, to the point that they're not probably in visual range of each other, but they can hear each other. And females can hear them. So in other words, you might have multiple males over a square kilometer or a couple miles. Female can hear them and make some decisions. But if she really wants to fully size them up, she's going to have to go to one of those males and see what he's all about.
So the call is the initial hook.
Yeah.
And then she goes in just to further evaluate.
And those males cue in off each other still, but by auditory. Dusky grouse, sooty grouse is a good example, where, if a male does his hoot, his auditory display, it's very common to hear 2 or 3 other males also hoot. They'll respond. They're like, oh, he might have a female. I'm gonna display. And there's females that are hearing that too, and she might go to one of them, but then when she shows up, he's putting on a show. He's strutting. He's got his fan. It looks a lot like a turkey, actually. He's got these big eye combs. He blows up these air sacs, gular air sacs on his throat, and they're brightly colored. So there's all these. It's very similar.
Yeah.
It's got all these what we call secondary sexual characteristics that really serve no function other than potentially to attract a mate, and they also, attract predators potentially. So there's both of those things happening. But that exploded lek and there's debate, amongst ecologists, like, should we even call that a lek? Because they could be separated by a tremendous distance. But there is still that female mate choice that's going on. There is still males that are aggregated at some level, and the female can size multiple males up quickly, which is really what this is all about, right? A female can quickly see what males are available to her and make a decision without having to cover a tremendous area.
It's efficient.
It's very efficient.
Yeah.
Yeah, very efficient. It's like, if you're a single human living in a community with 5 males versus 100 males, you got a lot more options to pick from. And so there's
It's
some
like going
efficiency.
to the bar and the guys are strutting around, trying to show off. You put on your nice clothes and comb your hair and put on some cologne.
I don't know what you're talking about.
But if we believe that exploded leks are a helpful construct to describe breeding ecology, then all of a sudden a lot of animals fit into it, including a lot of ungulates, elk, red deer, for sure, would fall under this classification. I would argue, if we're going to say turkey or exploded lek, then elk do too. And there's actually some data about red deer where they call them lecking animals.
Well, what about with turkeys? I'm thinking through characteristics about their breeding system that seem to fit loosely in this lecking idea, but other things that sort of conflict with it. And what you're describing is a sort of the spectrum of lecking, like you have a degree of lecking. Where are they at on that spectrum, and what characteristics sort of lend themselves to leck or exploded leck versus characteristics that don't really fit well? And
Yeah, so there's several kind of key characteristics that have been used to describe lecking. One, that the display area is not part of normal home range, and it's only visited part of the year. So that may or may not describe turkey. I mean, we know that they can move seasonally between winter areas and summer areas, but during the breeding season, they do often gravitate to similar locations day after day. But some of the research has clearly shown that hunting pressure and other human activity can shift that overnight, and all of a sudden they're completely, on another property. So that one's a little iffy, I would say, but that's one characteristic used to describe lecking. Another one that definitely fits wild turkey is their strong sexual dimorphism.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, in grouse, that's been used as kind of one of the key determinants of really strong lecking versus not lecking.
Yeah.
And think about greater sage grouse. A male weighs over 6 pounds, female 2 or 3 pounds, and they look very different. But sage grouse are at the extreme classic leck. Conversely, rough grouse, which don't leck, their body ratio size from male to female is very similar. And from a plumage standpoint, they're much more similar too.
Mm-hmm.
So wild turkey definitely fit that strong sexual dimorphism characteristic.
Although, just to play devil's advocate for a moment, there's also strong sexual dimorphism in species that are not even close to lecking.
That's true. Absolutely.
But I know before the show, at least when you were telling us about some of the information about when the dimorphism was sort of used to put grouse species, at least in a spectrum, and it predicts the degree of lecking pretty well, right?
Yeah, it's really correlated. Well, yeah. And it makes sense that if you're trying to stand out amongst a crowd when there's a lot of males present at the same time, you got to look different, right? You got to be different at some level.
Well, you said something that made me think of a question. Is there any density dependence in this, like with the sexual selection? Presumably, if you just have a few males, is the sexual selection pretty weak compared to when you have many males?
I have a question along those same lines.
Does it intensify that sexual selection where the female choice becomes really specific? I guess
that's a good question. That probably varies between species.
Well, I was also right. I mean, so you say it varies between species. Well, I was thinking kind of along the same lines as Marcus was, but instead of density dependence, in terms of differences among subspecies of wild turkeys in the environments they inhabit. I mean, is it possible that we see that like Rios or Miriams living in more open environments exhibit more characteristics of a lecking species, whereas Easterns that live primarily in forested landscapes don't exhibit that as strongly?
I'm glad you
lecking just within the species based on the
environment.
I'm glad you brought that up, because in some of the early literature on lecking, that was suggested that animals that occur in open landscapes, from an evolutionary standpoint, would tend to maybe be pushed by natural selection to leck.
Yeah.
Now, of course, as I said earlier, not all species fit that. Greater sage. Yeah, but I think early on, at least in birds, that was noted as like, wow, there's a lot of birds that leck in open country. But there's also a lot of birds that leck in forested country. The manakins are a good example. In fact, I don't know if you can put this on the podcast as a link, but we should put a link if you can. There's a bird called red-faced manakin. And if you're ever in doubt about how amazing animals are and how amazing birds are, and you've got somebody that's not too excited about birds, just pull up a YouTube clip of a red-faced manakin on a lek. It is incredible. But don't do this unless you have like 30 minutes because you're going to want to watch this clip like 100 times. And they'll put it like to Billie Jean music and MC Ham. But this bird's amazing. All these mannequins are amazing. They have these elaborate courtship displays where they use sound and visual characteristics to attract mates, and they're in dense jungle.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's extreme examples, but in general, I don't know that there is a general pattern. I mean, because I can think of lots of species that occur in landscapes where visual attraction kind of isn't really there until the female gets close.
Right. So there is a trend there, but there are exceptions to that.
Absolutely.
Trend.
Yeah. Absolutely. Another characteristic of lecking species is that there's some type of dominance relationship in males that might be somehow related to fitness, and that there's a positive relationship between that dominance and their reproductive success. Now, thinking about turkeys, does that fit? In other words, do males that have certain characteristics get more breeding opportunities? I think is really what we're saying there. Do we see evidence of that certain males have more reproductive opportunities and get to breed more?
Which we definitely see in turkeys.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
But, again, that fits lots of animals. So some of these, quote, lecking characteristics don't necessarily only pertain to lecking species, but kind of the collective group is traits that you see amongst species that are lecking.
Yeah, it seems like the general trend is that the more strongly a species exhibits lecking characteristics, the more individual males are able to dominate breeding opportunity.
Yeah, and related to that, one of the final characteristics of lecking is that there's an attraction of multiple females to specific males.
Mm-hmm.
Polygamy. They're not monogamous. They're one or a few males are getting a lot of breeding opportunities. Mm-hmm. And so a lot of females are being attracted to those males, and that's happening for brief periods of time. So this lecking period is not going on all year.
Yeah.
It's a concentrated breeding effort. And probably one thing we should have said earlier, like one of the drivers in the environment that would push animals to behave this way, to even lek to begin with, is that you've got, if you had really homogeneous resources like food and cover were uniformly distributed, there'd be less selective pressure to force this. But if things are more discrete, where you got concentration of resources, that could push an animal to behave this way, where it's like, either a concentrated spatial, the resources are concentrated over space or over time, where you need to breed rapidly for a brief amount of time, or you've got these resources that are kind of concentrated, so a lot of females, a lot of males can come together and kind of sort each other out really quickly. And you even see that you see that play out in related taxa. Like there's a couple of species of lechwe in Africa that are same genus, very closely related. One of them leks, one of them doesn't. And one of the mechanisms that's been used to describe, well, why is that? Why do they have this, divergence? Well, one of them occurs in an environment where resources are homogeneous and they're just kind of equally spread out across the landscape. So females come across a mate and they mate. Whereas the other one is more discrete, patchy resources. Males are concentrated. So are the females, so are the reproductive opportunities. So they've evolved to lek.
It's good stuff. Yeah.
A lot to think about.
So in these several species that are definitely classic or even exploded leckos even more, where we're hunting them during breeding, is there evidence from any of them that the hunting is causing a disruption that's resulting in lower productivity of the populations that they're in?
Not that I'm aware of. I mean, that prairie chicken paper we talked about earlier has kind of been used as like a case study, but it was one lek and nobody monitored those females. I mean, for all we know, they just went to a different lek and bred and went on about their business and didn't miss a beat. I mean, we have no idea. We just know those males were disrupted.
Yeah.
But the female doesn't need all those males. the whole population of females might only need 2 or 3 of them. And for all we know, they'd already made it anyway.
And based on the best available, most recent data that we have, it's in most populations, it seems like we're only harvesting about 30% of the adult males in a population with turkeys. And so that's leaving, not just a handful of males behind, 70% of the males.
Yeah.
Well, the other thing about that is that hasn't changed, right?
Right. Not over
Male
time.
harvest has been 30%.
Yeah, I mean, there's exceptions.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely places where a higher percentage.
And I think that's
but there's also places that are lower percentage are harvested. But my point is, if you take an average
Yeah.
back in the, when was that other work done in the 80s? It was 30% then too.
Yeah. But I think it is important to point out that you could certainly surpass some level of male harvest where you did actually start to impact breeding.
Oh,
Like if you were harvesting 70% of the males.
yeah. I mean, taken to the extreme, absolutely.
Right.
We just don't know where that is.
Right.
I think that's
Do we know that for any species that exhibits this kind of reproductive behavior?
with leks.
You're essentially saying
I
that
don't
the
think we
hunting
know
would
where that-
cause mate limitation.
Say that again.
The hunting would cause mate limitation, right? Where there's not enough males to, such that it's limiting the reproductive success of the population.
Yeah. And, I think just thinking about this broadly, if I'm going to believe that exploded lek is a useful construct, then I'm fine calling turkeys lecking because they can fit that definition. I think the more important question is what you guys are both getting at. Does it matter? I mean, from a hunting standpoint, does it change the way we hunt?
Right.
Should it change the way we hunt? Well, you definitely can't say that, well, there's no other examples of us hunting species like that. That's not true. But it does still, it's still a valid question to think about, well, timing of hunting, certainly how many males you're removing. Like, are we killing too many that females can't find to mate?
Right.
That would probably have to be a really high level.
Right.
But there's also these indirect things happening that I don't think we're talking enough about. Like, okay, well, what about not the effect of male removal or male disruption, but just all the human activity in the woods when the females are trying to nest? I mean,
No doubt.
how many of us have stepped on hens on the nest
Yeah.
and flushed them and caused nest abandonment?
Yeah.
Do you think that doesn't have an effect?
Have you ever done that?
Many times. Many times. So, that's something I've thought a lot about, like the shifting of seasons forward.
Yeah,
Are
like
we
delaying
stepping on more nests now? I mean,
Yeah.
cumulatively, what kind of effect is that going to have? I
Well,
think that is a
especially-
very good question to contemplate.
Even if we're not stepping on nests, I mean, there's some anecdotal data to suggest that, if you even get close to a hen when she's early in that incubation period, that she's more likely to abandon.
Well, and one thing that really made me critically think about this, and I mentioned it to Will this morning, and I guess by the time this comes out, some folks may already be on that. I'm kind of starting a segment where I'm reading one of Lovett's old books, and he's enlightening me on various things because he did a bunch of crazy stuff, like sit in a blind for weeks on end and do things that we can't really do nowadays. But he learned things and articulates it really well. But one thing that he noted that just really kind of shook me when I read it is he said, when hens are in good cover, they will allow people to approach up to within 8 feet without flushing.
Yeah.
But when they're in sparse cover,
Which
will-
describes most of our current landscape.
yeah, they will flush at much greater distances. And then I was like, oh my gosh, if we moved the 80% of hunting pressure that occurs in the first 2 weeks of season later in areas that are poor quality habitat where they are also flushing at much greater distances, which he noted in the book, that is concerning, that they would flush in poorer cover at greater distances, particularly in public lands where there's high human activity during nesting.
And then you layer on top of that those environmental characteristics, especially the openness and lack of concealment cover, would, hypothetically increase nest predation rates.
Yeah,
It stands
it
to
does,
reason
yeah.
that cumulatively could have a significant negative impact on fecundity.
Yes.
I think that for me, the kind of the take home from all this is that if we're worried about harvest or human activity and during that breeding season, we need to be thinking about more than just the male removal.
Mhm.
We know that turkeys are sensitive to human disturbance. That's been documented for avoidance of roads, disruption during the non-breeding season, when they're on their winter roost. So any high level of human activity during the spring, I think, warrants consideration. But the basic gist of it, we don't have much data on any of that.
Right.
And we certainly don't have a smoking gun to indicate that that's why turkeys are declining.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, they've got a lot of things going against them, and we know that habitat is very deficient all across much of the southeast.
Well, I mean, there's almost, based on what we've been doing for over a year, there's almost no way to, in my mind, that this isn't at the base, at the core, a habitat problem.
Mhm.
Especially given the many changes that have happened in the last couple of decades. I mean, it wouldn't surprise me that turkeys would decline in response to some of those changes. And we noted last week in our episode, a whole bunch of other non-game species aren't even hunted that are associated with the same types of vegetation are also pretty much across the board declining.
Yeah.
They're not, hunting isn't even part of it.
Right.
They're not hunted. So I think that's definitely interesting to think about more, and we should be considering it. And one of the biggest studies actually the only study that will have been published when we cover it, where we experimentally manipulated it. We'll go into this in great detail then. So we've got a lot of great episodes coming, trying to address
The conversation
what we
around-
know about these
Yeah.
different issues. So, well, Dwayne, as always, it's been really awesome discussion and enlightening. What are we missing here? Is there anything we're not talking about that in your mind is really relevant to this conversation, whether it's about lecking or any of this other stuff that you think we should touch on?
Well, I guess, I've thought a lot about this, not just the academic point of whether turkeys lek or don't lek, but mostly for me, what matters is that relevant when we're talking about harvest? And maybe it could be. There's not really data to suggest that it is or isn't. I think ultimately, kind of where I keep landing is more focused on total harvest. That would be the factor related to harvest that I would be more concerned about is total harvest. And think about this for bobwhite. I've said this before, like, it's as you get later in bobwhite season, like February, March, closer to the breeding season, the probability goes up that harvest might be additive, meaning that it might limit next fall's standing crop. Doesn't mean it is, because the numerics count more. So in other words, if we got a population of 1,000 bobwhite and we only kill one, well, you can kill it in June. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
One is one. It doesn't.
Right.
But as you shoot more of the animals with bobwhite, timing starts to maybe matter more. Yeah. And so I think you got to think about that from a turkey standpoint too. We're really worried about season timing, and that's fair to have that discussion and to critically think about everything we're doing. But you can't have that discussion without really thinking about numbers, because timing would only matter if as harvest level goes up, as we're shooting more of a population.
Right.
Which that you have to, we always end back here, especially we all not do, but as you decline in productivity, that becomes a more relevant discussion, because a symptom of poor productivity on the landscape is that male take would matter more. because the population's smaller and less productive.
Yeah, lower population size with lower reproductive potential, they're going to be less elastic, less able to withstand pressure, whether it's direct take of males, indirect disturbance of hens on the nest, all those things that we might be causing.
Yeah.
So the solution to all this is have good habitat and robust turkey populations.
Well, that's
the
what I was gonna
fix.
say. We have examples of several sites where the nesting success is near 50%.
Yeah.
The hen survival is 70 or 80%. We have, the poult rearing success is higher.
Yeah.
If you get in a landscape where you have 4 poults per hen, this is all moot.
Right.
And we've
The
seen
hunting conversation is not even an important one anymore because the productivity is so high. It doesn't, like you were saying, it doesn't matter anymore.
Yeah. And if the habitat quality and the amount of total habitat continues to decline, change in harvest is it's not going to move the needle, at a large scale.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that individual landowners shouldn't think about it. I think about it on our own property,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm kind of trying to assess how many males are out there, and we're setting our own quota based on what I see as a hedge. But if all my neighbors were contributing to turkeys and the landscape was covered in turkeys, I'd be a lot less worried about how many I'm shooting. So, I'm factoring in the landscape level potential of turkey productivity, which is low.
When you're the only one that has good habitat for reproduction and the rest of the landscape around you, then it certainly is, rising up the list. Right?
Yep.
And also strategies to try to get the surrounding landowners on board in some sort of cooperative situation. Yeah. It's really, really interesting discussion.
Good stuff.
Thank
Anything
you.
else you want to talk about, Dwayne? Or
Go look up red face mannequin. You won't be disappointed.
Down that rabbit hole later today. I can hear it to you.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
So,
well,
right.
I think one thing that's clear is all of us love turkeys, and we want to figure out how to make more of them and everything more sustainable, and trying to understand their basic biology and evolutionary history and all that is certainly a really important part of it. So thanks, Dwayne, for kind of walking us through that. I know you have such a great amount of wisdom and knowledge from all the work you've done on all these different species, and it's really valuable to tap into that. So appreciate you doing that.
Yeah,
thanks for
you. And if y'all were interested in this topic, you're going to be very interested in the next couple episodes that we have scheduled over the next few weeks, and we're going to kind of stay on this topic for a little while and look at it from different angles.
Yep.
Thank y'all. Enjoyed it as always.
Yep. And thanks out there for listening. Appreciate everybody that's rating the podcast and everything. With that being said, we do have another item.
Awesome.
So
it's a Benelli shotgun, right?
No. I wouldn't give that one away. I'd go rate the podcast randomly, select my rating.
Just make fun of me.
Yeah. So this week we have a couple of things. Honeycomb Game Calls.
Nice.
Has I don't know if that's the precise name of the business, but we'll link it in it. But yeah, he has been one of the longtime supporters of the show. Last year, some of the audience may remember, they did a special on some of their mouth calls and then donated a proportion of what they made off of it to my lab to support turkey research. So really appreciated that. But this time they donated a set of calls. So there's a friction call and some diaphragms that we're going to give away this week. So
one person gets all of that?
Well, I think the friction call is what we're going to give away this week. So and I've seen some of his handiwork. So he has some really, really awesome, beautiful calls. So yeah, did you select somebody this week?
No. Do you want me to do it now?
No, I already did. So yeah, last week I went and looked to see where the person was in the list, and they were sort of middle of the road. Which this week I was much more random, and it was actually just a really recent one. So the name on it is Joe from Georgia.
Okay. Joe from Georgia.
Yeah, another 5-star rating.
I think I know him.
You know Joe?
Joe
I
from
know
Georgia,
some
yeah.
Joes.
I think we all.
But when I did the sort of randomization, I went to look to see what they wrote, and I really appreciated what he wrote. He basically said, for anybody that loves a wild turkey and cares about their future, this podcast is the best listen.
We appreciate that.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. Like, really great review. So, Joe, if you're still listening, I hope you hadn't lost us since last 2 months ago. But yeah, reach out to us, and we'll get you connected, to get that friction call. So thanks everybody out there for listening. Really appreciate it.
Wild Turkey Science is part of the Natural Resources University podcast network and is made possible by Turkeys for Tomorrow, a grassroots organization dedicated to the wild turkey. To learn more about TFT, check out turkeysfortomorrow.org.